We're on now. We're waiting for a couple folks to pop up. Carol just popped on, so we apologize, Carol Miller. You have been talked about here a little bit by your brother, so I will let you know that on the video here. So I was going to see if she said anything. I'll let you know if she does.
She's texting me right now.
Oh, is she?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Fred and Ann are watching too. Hey, Fred and Ann and Julianne and a few people's on here right now. So we'll. It is it's 7:01 right now. So we will go ahead and get started and enjoy our little time this evening of Bible study. It seems like it's been quite a while since we've met. I mean, like Connie was saying, it does seem odd. It's every 2 weeks, so it kind of you kind of feel like it's been a while since we had it, but it has been. Plus, with Sunday being a little different, where some folks weren't here, and then we did it on a DVD, which was posted to a couple of sites. Some folks weren't here, so it seems a little different. But yeah, we're glad that you guys are here with us tonight, and for you guys that are joining us virtually, we're glad you're with us as well. We'll do a little Bible study this evening. Yeah, heard myself talking back there.
You want to hear yourself the whole night?
No, I'd rather not. Tonight, I guess part of what we'll be working with is getting ready with Abram. And I kind of figured, for me, I don't know about you guys, but when I think of Genesis, I mean, that's where I think it kind of really starts in a way, don't you think? Where we see really the nitty gritty of the biblical story beginning. I know we just did, with Adam and Eve and Noah and those characters as well, but we ran through that fairly quickly. It seemed like that bit of history. And remember, we had people who were, over 900 years old. So we had this wild period. And then there's Noah, who was blessed by God because of his righteousness to continue to go forward as he destroyed the earth with the flood, and that was humans and animals and birds and plant life and everything. And then we kind of closed out our last lesson with just kind of looking at some of the genealogy of the three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and that story. So tonight we will begin with chapter 11. Chapter 11 is fairly quick too, because there's one story in there, then the rest of it kind of deals with some lineage accounts of Shem's family. And we'll read through that a little bit, but just kind of look at the ages, how they've sort of really begun to change in that particular period of time. So let's begin with a word of prayer, though. God, we do give you thanks for this day, and we do give you thanks for the rain. We did need some. It seems like it had been... not only the weather has been warm, but it's been a little dry as well. And so we're blessed to have this. And eventually we'll get into more of a fall season. But right now we kind of enjoy this. And we're blessed to be here this evening, whether it's here in the sanctuary or whether it's our virtual community joining us on Facebook. And then we'll let some folks enjoy this on YouTube a little bit later. But we ask that you just be with us in our time of study and help us to think about what these things mean and how we can review this history of your people, as especially we get into Abram and Abraham, who becomes Abraham, and how that kind of sets in motion this new community, this new society, this new nation that'll eventually come out of this. And so we actually just be with us in this time of study, and just bless those that are here, bless those that can't be for whatever reason, and we just thank you so much for all you do in Christ's name. Amen. So our first story that we will look at in chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel. We all know that little story, and we've heard it before. And what happened? It's a quick story, as it shares here. It's only 9 verses, but it would be a period of time that would be longer than we could expand on in here. This would be a number of years, because this is as the nations are beginning to develop and grow. at the end of chapter 10 in verse 32, it said, "These are the clans that descended from Noah's son, arranged by nation according to the lines of descent. All the nations of the earth descended from these clans after the great flood." And in order to have nations, we're going to have quite a number of people already established, aren't we, in the midst of this? And so we've seen that now. So we move to chapter 11, and it says, "At one time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words." Imagine that everybody could speak the same language and could read the same things as well. As the people migrated to the east, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia and settled there, which kind of tells us that we are beginning to have cities develop, aren't we? Regions are developing. So we've got a vast amount of time that's taken place since Noah and his sons and the wives all got off that boat, that ark. And so we've had this massive amount of time that's taken place. And now we see this group of people who've moved to the east, it says, come to this plain. They all talk the same. They know this, they speak the same. They can read the same words. And so they have this in common, don't they? And so they began to say to each other, "Let's make bricks and harden them with fire." In this region, my Bible notes that the bricks that were used instead of stone and tar was used for mortar. They said to themselves, "Come, let us build a great city for ourselves with a tower that reaches into the sky, and this will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world." What were they trying to do you think? Just because you're on camera doesn't mean you can't answer. What was going on, do you think, in the midst of this? What's the intent of this large tower that they're building when you read those words? It's kind of like a temple, but think about what they're saying. They said, "Make us." Part of it, that's what we kind of. Yeah, we would say it's the tower. It's that they're trying to reach to heaven, but they're trying to prove who they are. And who do they think they might be greater than in the midst of it all if they reach that high? It'd be God, wouldn't it? The story is usually used when it talks about pride, when we talk about pride, because it's the pride of these people. You know, we're going to do this together. We're going to be famous for what we have done. And then they make note, remember, that they don't want to be scattered throughout the world. But the Lord came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. "Look," he said, "the people are united and they all speak the same language," which in of itself sounds okay, doesn't it? To say they're united in doing something as well as they speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them, because the more people that come, if you can speak the same language, there's no barriers, are there, in what you can do? Because when you think about, now in the midst of our own global world, I mean, people can basically speak different languages, but what's one common language most people can speak is English, isn't it? Most people can speak fairly fluent English, if not at least broken English. So, I don't know, that kind of works back to this a little bit, doesn't it? Because we do sort of work together as a global community, don't we? And we value that language that helps to not inhibit that barrier of putting us at a great distance in certain ways. So here he says that things will not be impossible for them to do. "Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages, and then they won't be able to understand each other." This is sort of the opposite of another story we hear later in Scripture, isn't it? Here, they're scattering people and dividing people with their language so they can't understand one another. What's another story where we talk about various languages, but it does something totally opposite, doesn't it? The story of Pentecost, isn't it? Is that in the midst of that, you needed that common language, in a sense, for everyone to hear the gospel story, didn't you? And so God provided it on that particular day. Here it's a separation of people so they go their own way, so that they don't become so powerful in and among themselves that they all of a sudden become like God. And that's what he's trying to keep them from doing. In that way, the Lord scattered them all over the world, and they stopped building the city. That's why the city was called Babel. Babel means blah, blah, blah. To babble on, to continue to talk, doesn't it? And this is why the city was called Babel, because that is where the Lord confused the people with different languages. And in this way, he scattered them all over the world. I was looking at a couple things in this Bible here. It has an observation point which says, Babel sounds like a Hebrew word meaning confused, which is sort of where it would get its origins, would be that word means confused. Because isn't that what God did in that moment? But can you imagine standing side by side with somebody, you're speaking the same language, and then within just like that, all of a sudden you're going, what'd you say? Would you're all of a sudden, if you have all of these people begin to speak different languages, it's going to create confusion, isn't it? So Babel, it makes sense that it would be that. It can also be translated as Babylon. We're going to see that later because it was actually the Assyrians that scattered Israel, but Babylon brought them into the one area together. Babel was the site of one of the earliest attempts humans made to exalt themselves and rebel against God as the divine ruler and authority. The city was probably built from bricks and tar because stones were scarce in Mesopotamia. So that was sort of the region where it is. So that's just one of our interesting stories here. And it really helps us as we begin to develop our different nation states coming up through here, isn't it? And especially when we get to later in Scripture and we see that there's various peoples gathered on that day of Pentecost, and each one speaks, and people speak different languages. You have to have this mishmash of languages in a sense now, and here's where that's created. And I like how it puts it here. It reminds us that this is one way God sort of confused these languages so that they could not make themselves greater than who He is already. I mean, that's sort of where Adam and Eve found themselves, wasn't it? They found that they knew more, in a sense, than God because they ate from the tree of good and evil. They knew what was going on. So now we have this scattering of people around this world. And so we're going to enter into this new period here. And we're going to just see, starting at verse 10, the line of descent from Shem to Abram. So that kind of tells us, remember there were three sons, right? Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so we can see that this lineage starts with Shem. And where will it end? It goes to Jesus, doesn't it? Yeah. Because Abram, David, all those would be in that same lineage here. Reading through a few of these, it says that in this account of Shem's family, and we'll just read these. 2 years after the great flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of this one kid guy. Arphaxad, I guess is what his name is. Shem lived another 500 years and had other sons and daughters. It's interesting. It doesn't tell us how many, but we can kind of speculate that it had to be quite a number of them, didn't it? And I think it was the other week that Greg, we were trying to figure out how many it might have been at some point earlier on. But imagine how this continues to build and to build and to build as we're carrying on with this. Then his son was 35 when he became a father, and he lived 403 years. I'm going to skip down. You can go through there and look at some of these sons and then the years they lived and the fact that they had other sons and daughters, it wants us to say. It's interesting that only one son gets to be in the lineage. Everybody else is kind of out there. Why would you think that? But I mean, if each son, I mean, they have other sons and daughters, it says, but you only have one son that gets counted in lineage in a sense. I'm thinking it's because it's the firstborn son. And so he gets recognized where everybody else just kind of gets, we're just part of the family. But it's the first son that's counted in there. And if you look at verse 26, go to verse 26, you will see when Terah was 70 years old, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So now we see who Abram's father is Terah. So the family of Terah in verse 27, it says this. This is the account of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran was the father of Lot. We've heard of Lot, haven't we? But Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth, while his father Terah was still living. Meanwhile, Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Milcah and her sister Iscah were daughters of Nahor's brother Haran. So you see how that kind of works in here, don't you? But Sarah was unable to become pregnant and had no children, which is part of the story we always think about with Sarah, isn't it? I guess Sarai right now is that she was barren. And so one day Terah took his son Abram, his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, his grandson Lot, and moved away from Ur of the Chaldeans. He was headed to the land of Canaan, but they stopped at Haran and settled there. Do you remember which one of Noah's sons the Canaanites came from? Which was the son that witnessed his father naked and went out laughing? It was Ham, wasn't it? Yeah, he was the one. So, and that's just an interesting point, I think, is we still could connect the dots of where these sons were in certain places. Terah lived for 205 years and died while still in Haran, while still in Haran. So at least the ages are kind of settling down a little bit, aren't they, here? We don't do what?
The one before that was 119.
That's right, yeah. So the ages are starting to settle in a little bit more in line of what I don't guess we would say that we're used to, but just knowing that people aren't living to be, hundreds of years old, So chapter 12, we see this. The Lord said to Abram, and it's interesting he picks Abram, isn't it? He never tells us, in a sense, why in most of this, but he appears to Abram, he finds Abram, and it's Abram that he settles with and realizes this is the one who he wants to continue on with in his midst of his lineage. I think we're going to find out more about Abram, a little bit about his faith and what he would do. Because he was called to do something that I'm not sure how many of us will be willing to just do. With God telling us to do it. When it says, the Lord said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. Now, you notice, and I think that's what we always like to review or to look at is, God just tells him that you go where I am telling you to go, or I will show you. But he doesn't tell him where it's going to be yet, does it? What does Abram do? God says, leave your country, leave your relatives, leave all these things behind, and I will show you where to go. They didn't have GPSs, did they? They didn't have computers, they didn't have all these things. Can you imagine what that must have been to do that? I mean, it's why we count him a man of having great faith, don't we? Because what does Abram do? He does it, doesn't he? I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and I will make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. So really, in a sense, this lineage, this people of God is basically what it is, isn't it? Are going to start with Abram, aren't they? So we've had this lineage of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and we've had this lineage of Shem where he comes from, but all of a sudden it's going to branch down a little bit when we think about now the people of Israel, isn't it? Because this is where this is going to start. That God promised him that you're going to be blessed. God promised him and told him you're going to be the father of the nations, is what we say. He promised him. He says, you will be famous. And not only will you be blessed, but you will be a blessing to others. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Lot was his nephew, right? The son of Haran. And so he's gone with Abram and Sarai. And he took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all of his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and headed for the land of Canaan. You know, that has to have been a huge caravan, don't you think? That it talks about his wealth. Imagine how much livestock he must have. Imagine how many people he has in the midst of this group that he is going in. I don't know how big it is, but it has to be this overwhelming sight of all these people. And imagine people in other nations or other places going, what in the world is coming down through here? Must be a stampede, of people and animals and all those many things. When they arrived at Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem, and there he set up camp inside the oak of Moreh. And at that time, the area was inhabited by the Canaanites. It was, there's a note in here that shares that after leaving going to Haran, and then ended up in Canaan, that this distance Abraham traveled was roughly the same as the distance from Chicago, Illinois to Denver, Colorado. Can you imagine walking from Chicago to Denver? That's sort of what we're looking at. If you could imagine, I can't imagine. I can see what it looks like on the map, but just to think about what that must have been to walk that's quite a trek that he's gone on. Verse 7 says, Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And he didn't say to Abram right now, did he? But he's going to give it to his descendants. And Abram builds an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who appeared to him. Was it the other week we talked about that with Noah, where he got out and he built an altar, didn't he, to God, and he sacrificed on it? Notice here, that's what Abram does as well, isn't it? He builds an altar here in this particular region, or this area that he is now settled into for the moment. And a lot of times those altars, it could have been for sacrifice, but it also could be just as a memorial or a remembrance site of where he found himself talking to God and where God settled him in the midst of all of this. After that, he traveled south and set up camp in the hill country, with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built another altar, and he dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord. And then Abram continued traveling south by stages toward the Negev. Next time we should have maps, I guess, through this as we're doing some of these travels. But we're still sort of in that same region of the Arabian desert it shows here. So you're going to have them in that area out there where we're most familiar with, especially as we see now in verse 10 as they're going to reach the area of Egypt. And that Egypt is sort of in northern Africa, isn't it? Kind of up in that region, up in there. And so we can kind of figure about where we will end up for a little bit. And it's interesting to me because we're going to see here that there's a Pharaoh, which means that Egypt has become in itself a nation state, hasn't it? Has begun to grow. So we can see that this period of time is truly beginning to develop in some way. In verse 10 it says, at that time a severe famine struck the land of Canaan. Isn't it interesting that all these people get struck of famines, and where do they end up at? Egypt, don't they? To take care of that. But what's one of the things that Egypt has that helps in that process of eliminating famine in some way? What do you need for crops to grow?
You need water.
And what's in Egypt? The Nile River, isn't it? Which supposedly was a great river for irrigation, and that the Egyptians, and when we get to the area when Jacob goes in, or those groups of people, we realize that they have become. Egypt will become one of those great civilized nations that has been able to tame the Nile River in some way, because stories will tell you that they were able to navigate, or at least irrigate their crops with the Nile River and not get it flooded. You know, that they had developed such a great sense of agriculture, not just in their society that was building buildings and doing other things, but they were able to navigate that river in such a way that they could grow their crops. That's where they would grow. It was right near the river, because anywhere else, if you're away from that, you've got to transport water, so it made it much easier. And so I kind of think that when we think about famines in some of these other regions, because the water is not there. And the other thing is most of the people in some of these more northern regions, these desert regions, were nomadic. So that meant that they did move and move and move because they depended on their livestock. And if you run out of food for the livestock in one place, what do? You move them to another area. So you continually are moving yourself. But now we're finding that there's a famine, which probably not only affected the livestock, it also affected the people, didn't it? And so what's going to happen here? It says, as this famine struck the land of Canaan, it forced Abram to go down to Egypt, where he lived as a foreigner. You know, because he's not Egyptian, is he? He is Canaan. He is Ur. Actually, he's an Ur. Ern? Well, I don't know what you'd call him. But he's a child of God. And so he is up in that particular area now. So he's in Egypt. Now, this is going to be the first of at least of two stories, if you can remember your reading of Genesis and your history, where Abram and then Abraham is going to pull a little tall tale, we might say, with his wife Sarah. Do you know the story? You know what we're talking about, don't you? He's going to lie a little bit, isn't he? And it gets him in trouble because it gets the Pharaoh in trouble. Or I think the other one, I think the other one was the Pharaoh too, or another king that he does it to. So the story says, as he was approaching the border of Egypt, Abram said to his wife Sarai, "Look, you are a very beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife. Let's kill him, and we can have her.' So please tell them you are my sister. And then they will spare my life and treat me well because of their interest in you." Well, that could possibly backfire in many ways, can it not? Which it is. But what could happen to Sarah if he's not careful? They could take her, couldn't they? And kill him anyway, regardless if it's his sister or what. But that's not what's going to happen, but it's going to be a little troublesome in some ways. And sure enough, when Abram arrived in Egypt, everyone noticed Sarai's beauty. When the palace officials saw her, they sang her praises to Pharaoh, the king, and Sarai was taken into his palace. Then Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of her: sheep, goats, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. He was going to gift Abram, and in hopes that he could do what? He could have Sarai, right? It was sort of as we'll see later, what is it, kind of a dowry? You know, you pay for that. You have to give them something. But the Lord sent terrible plagues upon Pharaoh. Now, I have to admit, I feel sorry for Pharaoh in this story because he was taken advantage of, was he not? But who's the one that is affected or the one who really gets sort of the bad end of the deal? Isn't it Pharaoh? What does it say? But the Lord sent plagues upon Pharaoh and his household because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh summoned Abram and accused him sharply. And it's interesting that Pharaoh has this wisdom when he says, "Why have you done this to me?" He demanded, "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" Pharaoh knew. Pharaoh found out through these plagues, and I guess it had to be told in some way. Why didn't you just say she's my sister and allow me to take her as my wife? Now here is your wife. Take her and get out of here. Pharaoh ordered some of his men to escort them, and he sent Abram out of the country along with his wife and all his possessions. He could have lived in there comfortably, but he just decided he was going to lie about this, didn't he? So we're going to see this again happen, though, later on in the text, or in a couple of chapters later, that Abram's going to kind of doesn't learn this lesson and what it means. Just be honest about it, isn't he? I mean, maybe that's what the story wants us to realize is Abram, all he had to do was be honest about it, wasn't he? Even if he did lose his life. But was he going to lose his life because God had an intent for him, did he not? It's going to be kind of like when we reach the story of Abraham and Hagar, right? That did not God promise that he would be a man with many, that many nations would come through him, that he would have many descendants? We realize right now that Sarah is barren, which means she can't have children. But God's up to something, is he not? And in this lapse of I would just say, of being human, there's a lesson there for Abram in the midst of this. And definitely a lesson for Pharaoh. To be careful with who comes down into his land. But the other thing is in the midst of this famine, they get kicked out. They got kicked out because of this. So we're going to continue on for a little bit here because we need to come back to Lot. And that's where we go into chapter 13. We've had this story that Abram and Sarah have sort of been banished, kicked out, whatever you want to say, from Egypt because of this lie that Abram told, which caused these plagues to come upon Pharaoh. And so they are kind of on their own. So chapter 13 says, so Abram left Egypt and he traveled north into the Negev. Remember, that's where they came from, wasn't it? Because it didn't say that territory is where the famine was. Along with his wife and Lot and all that they owned. And it kind of tells us again, Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. And from the Negev, they continued traveling by stages toward Bethel. And they pitched their tents between Bethel and Ai, where they had camped before. This was the same place where he had built an altar and had worshiped the Lord there. So they kind of just travel. It looks like the same direction, aren't they? Going back up north. Lot, who was traveling with Abram, had also become very wealthy. And I'm kind of curious how he became wealthy too. But I don't know how their source or their income, how they expanded their livestock. Well, I can imagine they expand livestock, but everything they had, so it became each their own. But nonetheless, Abram is very wealthy, but Lot himself has become very wealthy as well, with flocks of sheep, goats, herds of cattle, and many tents. And tents would signify wealth because you have to have a number of people that travel with you, right? And remember, they're nomadic, meaning they're traveling, they're walking wherever they go. They're not just settling in one particular place. They're moving back and forth. It's kind of like folks folks who might sell their home and they buy one of those huge RVs and all they do is travel around. Go from campsite to campsite and then just spend, months or even whatever doing it. They're kind of nomadic, aren't they? And so that's what Lot and Abram and all of them are. So tents will be very important because that will signify how many people you have in whatever in your I don't say possession, in your group, in your status. Yeah. But the land could not support both Abram and Lot with all their flocks and herds living so close together, which kind of gives us a clue that they had a lot of livestock, didn't they? That they couldn't live together. So disputes broke out between the herdsmen of Abram and Lot. At that time, Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land. So not only are they contending within themselves, are they? They're contending with all the other persons that live in those regions as well. So land is kind of not really scarce, but it's not there for everybody, is it? And so you kind of have to pick and choose. Finally, Abram said to Lot, "Let's not allow this conflict to come between us or our herdsmen. After all, we're close relatives. The whole countryside is open to you. Take your choice of any section of land you want, and we will separate. If you want land to the left, then I'll take the land to the right. If you prefer the land to the right, then I'll go to the left." Lot took a long look at the fertile plains of the Jordan Valley and in the direction of Zoar. The whole area was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord or the beautiful land of Egypt. And this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot chose for himself the whole Jordan Valley to the east of them. He went there with his flocks and his servants and parted company with his uncle Abram. So Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot moved his tents to the place near Sodom, which gives us a clue of the story that comes up next, doesn't it, for us? But the people of this area were extremely wicked and constantly sinned against the Lord. After Lot had gone, the Lord said to Abram, "Look as far as you can in every direction, north and south, east and west. I am giving all this land as far as you can see to you and your descendants as a permanent possession. And I will give you so many descendants that like the dust of the earth, they cannot be counted. Go and walk through the land in every direction, for I am giving it to you." So Abram moved his camp to Hebron and settled near the oak grove belonging to the Mamre. There he built another altar to the Lord. So, Abram's got to realize that God is doing something for them, isn't he? He says, you're going to have many descendants. Now remember, at this point in time, how many children does Abram and Sarah have? None. None. And I think it was in one section, did we skip over? It said that Abram was about 75 years old at this time. So 75 years later, he hasn't had children yet. But God's going, you're going to have many descendants. So when you think of descendants, it means you're going to have children, aren't you? So this has to happen somehow. But he's not thinking about that right at the moment, is he? It's just, we need to get settled first. We need to find our place. And it's interesting when God says, look in every direction and that's your land. That's a long ways. It's a lot of territory, isn't it? But it was enough that even Lot had some. Way, 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 way over there. But Lot, as we see, it kind of wants us to be sure to remember, Lot is near Sodom. And Sodom is one of our stories that we talk about. Which is where we're going to head to here in a little bit. We'll try to go through some of... we'll go through chapter 14 for a moment, because that'll sort of set us up for the next time we're together as we think about Lot. We think about this region that he's in. Chapter 14 says, about this time war broke out in the region. King Amraphel of Babylonia, King Arioch of Elasar, King Kedorlaomer, I guess, of Elam, and King Tidal of Giam fought against King Bera of Sodom, King Bersha of Gomorrah, King Shinab of Adnama, King Shemember of Zebulun, and the king of Bela, also called Zoar. The second group of kings joined forces in Sidon Valley, that is the valley of the Dead Sea. We know what that's talking about. We know where the Dead Sea is kind of located. For 12 years, they had been subject to this king of Elam. But in the 13th year, they rebelled against him. So, it's interesting to see that we've got these kingdoms established already, in the midst of just 14 chapters. So the world has really grown, hasn't it, in the midst of this? All of these descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth have all become their own groups of people. One year later, Kedorlaomer and his allies arrived and defeated the Raphaites and the Zuzites and the Emites and the Horites. I'm not going to say where they are because I can't pronounce some of them. And at the edge of the wilderness, they turned back and came to En Mishpat, now called Kadesh, and conquered all the territory of the Amalekites and also the Amorites living in Hazatamar. Then the rebel kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboam, and Bela, also called Zoar, prepared for battle in the valley of the Dead Sea. They fought against the king of Elam, King Tidal of Gileam, King Amphrael of Babylonia, and King Arloch of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. As it happened, the valley of the Dead Sea was filled with tar pits. What are tar pits? Well, pits of tar, aren't they? We think about those, and I think about the woolly mammoths, don't you? and in dinosaur days. As the army of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into the tar pits, while the rest escaped into the mountains. The victorious invaders then plundered Sodom and Gomorrah and headed for home, taking with them all the spoils of war and the food supplies. They also captured Lot, Abram's nephew who lived in Sodom, and carried off everything he owned. I mean, he was kind of just a bystander, but he was a very wealthy bystander, wasn't he? So he had a lot of goods that they wanted, didn't he? But one of Lot's men escaped and reported everything to Abram the Hebrew, who was living near the oak grove belonging to the Mamre, the Amorite. Mamre and his relatives, Eshcol and Aner, were Abram's allies. When Abram heard that his nephew Lot had been captured, he mobilized the 318 trained men who had been born into his household. He pursued Kedorlaomer's household, or army, until he caught up with them at Dan. There he divided his men and attacked during the night. Kedorlaomer's army fled, but Abram chased them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. Abram discovered all the goods that had been taken and brought his nephew and his possessions and all the women and other captives. Brought all those back. He only had 318 men, and he took on a whole army, which is kind of interesting in itself, isn't he? And not only did he fight, he won, didn't he? And he was able to return Lot and everything that Lot had back to his home. And then there's this story, after Abraham returned from his victory over Kedorlaomer and all his allies, the king of Sodom went out and met him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, who was the king of Salem and a priest of the God Most High, brought Abram some bread and wine. Melchizedek blessed Abram with his blessing. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you, which is giving credit to who? To God, isn't it? For this victory. Then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all of his goods he had recovered. King of Sodom said to Abram, give back my people who were captured, but you may keep for yourself all the goods you have recovered. So Abram replied to the king of Sodom, I solemnly swear to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will not take so much as a single thread or sandal thong from what belongs to you. Otherwise, you might say, I am the one who made Abram rich. I will accept only what my young warriors have already eaten, and I request that you give a fair share of the goods to my allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. And so there's his meeting with Melchizedek. But it also kind of puts us to where we see that there's a lot going on in these territories, isn't it? There's a lot of fighting that's going to be happening. There's a lot of this, we're going to overtake lands. But we've also noticed as well that most of these are not lands where God is worshipped. And so, but there's this idea that Melchizedek understands that it was God who gave him the victory, gave Abram the victory, wasn't it? And so that's kind of an interesting thing for us to find out in the midst of all of this. So when we come back in a couple of weeks, well, let's see. That'll be Thanksgiving week, so we probably won't come back for probably about 4 weeks, probably. We'll be sure to put that into a note somewhere. Yeah, it kind of puts us on a bind when it comes to this time of the year, but we'll catch up at some point, with one another. And so, so that's where we'll be. So be just mindful of that. It will be in chapter 15, and that's where we're going to have, I think we're going to have Abram called Abraham when we get into the snow section. So, well, thanks for coming out, and may you be blessed as you continue to do the work that God calls you to do as well. And we'll see you guys as well.